Picture this, a Sherman crew rolling through the Belgian countryside, spotting a German Panther emerging from behind a stone farmhouse. The commander's stomach drops. He knows what comes next. His tank's gun will fire, the shell will strike that sloped armor, and it will ricochet into the sky like a stone skipping off water. Then the Panther's gun will answer, and his crew won't have time to pray. Except this time, something is different. This time, the loader slides a shell into the breech that looks nothing like what they've been firing for months. The gunner doesn't understand what makes it special. He just knows that headquarters called it classified, that only certain tanks receive them, and that the Germans supposedly have no defense against it. The trigger is pulled. The Panther explodes so violently that its turret cartwheels through the air like a child's toy. And in that moment, everything changes. What was this shell that turned America's most common tank into a giant killer? Why was it kept secret even from most Allied commanders? And how did a round so devastating remain virtually unknown until the final months of the war? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn of 1944 carried with it a bitter chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Across the fields of France and the Low Countries, American armored divisions pressed forward against an enemy that refused to break. The liberation of Paris had filled newspapers with triumph, but the men inside the Sherman tanks knew a darker truth. Every advance brought them closer to the German border, and every mile meant facing armor that could destroy them from distances they could barely see. The Wehrmacht had learned to use its heavy tanks with surgical precision, positioning them in tree lanes and behind rubble where they could ambush entire columns before a single American gun could respond. Captain James Morrison of the 2nd Armored Division had watched 5 Shermans from his company burn in a single afternoon near the town of Aircourt. The engagement had begun with a crack that split the air, a sound he had come to dread more than artillery. One of his tanks simply stopped moving, smoke pouring from every hatch. Then another. The German tank remained invisible, firing from concealment somewhere beyond a ridgeline. Morrison's remaining crews had returned fire desperately, pumping round after round toward the suspected position, but their shells accomplished nothing. When reconnaissance finally spotted the attacker, it was a Panther, hull down behind earthworks, nearly 2,000 yards distant. At that range, the standard 75mm gun might as well have been throwing rocks. This was the reality of armored warfare in late 1944. The Sherman, built in staggering numbers and shipped across oceans to equip entire armies, had become a symbol of American industrial might. Factories in Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh churned them out by the thousands. Crews could be trained quickly, maintenance was straightforward, and the tanks could be transported efficiently. Yet for all these advantages, the Sherman carried a fatal flaw. Its main gun, adequate against the medium panzers of North Africa and the early campaigns in Italy, had become obsolete against the new generation of German armor. The Panther's frontal plate, sloped at 60 degrees and over 3 inches thick, deflected American shells as if they were hailstones. The Tiger, rarer but even more fearsome, could engage Shermans from ranges where return fire was suicide. The men who fought in these machines understood the mathematics of survival in ways that no training manual could teach. They learned to move in packs, trying to flank German heavies while accepting that some of their number would die in the process. They learned to call for air support, for artillery, for anything that might level the playing field. They learned which roads to avoid and which pieces of terrain offered cover. Most of all, they learned to dread the sight of a long gun barrel emerging from the shadows, because it meant that someone in their platoon was about to die, and there was almost nothing they could do about it. In Washington, far from the smoke and terror of the front lines, the problem had not gone unnoticed. Reports flowed back from theater commanders throughout 1943 and into 1944, each one more urgent than the last. General Omar Bradley himself had written that the Sherman's inability to engage German heavy armor on equal terms was costing lives and slowing the advance. The British, fighting alongside American units, had developed their own solution by mounting the 17-pounder gun on modified Shermans called Fireflies, but production of these conversions was limited, and they remained a British asset. American crews continued to fight with what they had been given, trusting in numbers and tactics to overcome the deficiencies in their equipment. The United States Army Ordnance Department had not been idle during these months of crisis. Engineers and ballistics experts had been working on multiple approaches to the problem. One path involved developing an entirely new tank, something that would eventually emerge as the Pershing with its 90mm gun. But new tanks required time, retooling of factories, training of crews, and a logistics chain that stretched across the Atlantic. The war could not wait for perfection. What was needed was something that could be implemented immediately, something that could transform the existing fleet of Shermans already in Europe without requiring them to be shipped back for major modifications. The answer lay not in redesigning the tank itself but in reimagining the ammunition it fired. For years, armor-piercing rounds had relied on a simple principle: a hardened steel projectile moving at high velocity would punch through enemy armor through sheer kinetic energy. The thickness and hardness of the penetrator, combined with its speed, determined how much armor it could defeat. American 75mm armor-piercing rounds had been designed to handle the panzers of 1942. They had never been intended to face the armored monsters that Germany fielded in 1944. Increasing the velocity of existing rounds helped, but only marginally. The fundamental problem remained that a 75mm shell simply did not carry enough mass and energy to penetrate the thickest German armor at combat ranges. Then someone asked a different question. What if the penetrator didn't need to be as large as the gun barrel? What if you could fire a much smaller, much denser projectile at even higher velocities by surrounding it with a lightweight carrier that fell away after leaving the barrel? The concept was not entirely new. German engineers had experimented with similar ideas, and the British had their own development programs. But the American version of this technology would prove to be something extraordinary, a round so effective that it would be classified above top secret and issued only to select units under the strictest security protocols. The projectile was called the high-velocity armor-piercing round, though those who fired it in combat would simply know it by its designation, HVAP. At its core was a principle borrowed from physics rather than traditional military engineering. Instead of a solid steel shell, the HVAP round featured a tungsten carbide penetrator, a material far denser and harder than steel, encased in a lightweight aluminum jacket. When fired, the entire assembly left the barrel at velocities that exceeded anything previously achieved by a tank gun of that caliber. But the moment it struck armor, the aluminum jacket shattered and fell away, leaving only the tungsten core to continue forward. This dense spike of metal, traveling at tremendous speed and concentrating all its energy on a tiny impact point, could punch through armor that seemed impervious to conventional rounds. The development process had been fraught with challenges. Tungsten was a strategic material, already in high demand for machine tools and other military applications. Allocating enough of it to produce ammunition in meaningful quantities required approvals at the highest levels of government. The manufacturing process itself demanded precision that pushed the limits of existing production techniques. Each round had to be balanced perfectly, the tungsten core centered within its jacket with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Any imperfection would cause the round to tumble in flight, destroying its accuracy. Early test batches failed repeatedly, shells disintegrating in the barrel or veering wildly off target. By the spring of 1944, however, the problems had been solved. Test firings at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland produced results that shocked even the engineers who had designed the ammunition. At 1,000 yards, an HVAP round fired from a standard Sherman 75mm gun penetrated 5 inches of armor plate angled at 30 degrees. This was performance that matched or exceeded the penetration of guns twice the caliber. At shorter ranges, the results were even more dramatic. A Panther's frontal armor, previously considered immune to Sherman fire, could be defeated at ranges under 800 yards. Even the Tiger, that seemingly invincible fortress on tracks, became vulnerable from the side or at closer distances. The implications were staggering. Without modifying a single tank, without retraining crews on new weapon systems, the United States could potentially transform every Sherman in Europe into a credible threat against German heavy armor. But there was a problem, and it was one that would haunt American armored operations for the remainder of the war. Tungsten was simply too scarce to produce HVAP ammunition in the quantities that would be needed. Even with maximum production, there would never be enough rounds to issue them as standard ammunition. Hard choices had to be made about allocation, about which units would receive this wonder weapon and which would continue to fight with conventional shells. The decision was made at the highest levels of command to treat HVAP as a strategic asset, as valuable as intelligence about enemy positions or the availability of air support. The ammunition would be classified, its capabilities kept secret not only from the enemy but from most Allied personnel. Only select tank crews would receive it, and even they would be given strict instructions about when and how it could be used. Each round would be accounted for, its use documented and justified. Commanders were told that HVAP was to be employed only against heavy German armor and only when conventional ammunition had proven ineffective. The hope was that by carefully controlling its distribution and use, by preventing the Germans from capturing intact rounds for study, the Allies could maintain the element of surprise for as long as possible. In June of 1944, as the invasion of Normandy unfolded across the beaches and hedgerows of France, the first HVAP rounds arrived in Europe. They came in small batches, delivered under guard to divisional supply depots where they were logged and secured like gold bullion. Unit commanders received sealed orders explaining the nature of the ammunition and the restrictions on its use. Crews who were selected to receive HVAP were briefed separately, warned that discussing the rounds with anyone outside their immediate unit could result in court-martial. The secrecy was so tight that many tankers fought through the entire Normandy campaign without ever knowing that such ammunition existed. Those who did receive HVAP treated it with a mixture of reverence and desperation. They carried perhaps 5 or 10 rounds per tank, stored separately from their regular ammunition and marked with distinctive bands of colored paint. Loaders were instructed to use conventional armor-piercing rounds first in any engagement, switching to HVAP only if those shots proved ineffective or if they positively identified a Panther or Tiger. The psychological impact of possessing this ammunition was profound. Crews who had felt helpless against German heavy armor now carried something that gave them a fighting chance. They knew that if they encountered a Panther, if they could get within range and place their shot precisely, they might survive the encounter. It transformed their understanding of what was possible. The first recorded use of HVAP in combat came during the fighting around Caen in early July. A platoon of Shermans from the 3rd Armored Division had been supporting infantry clearing a village when German tanks were reported moving up from the south. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The American tanks took position behind a low stone wall, their commanders scanning the tree line with binoculars. Then the Panthers appeared, 3 of them, advancing in a loose formation across an open field. The range was approximately 700 yards, close enough to engage but far enough that conventional ammunition would likely prove useless against their frontal armor. The platoon leader, Lieutenant Robert Chen, made the decision to use HVAP. His gunner, a corporal from Pennsylvania named Eddie Martinez, had never fired a live HVAP round before. Everything he knew came from a brief demonstration and the specifications sheet he had been ordered to memorize and then destroy. Martinez centered the lead Panther in his sight, adjusting for range in the slight crosswind. The tank was moving slowly, buttoned up, its commander likely unaware that American tanks were even present. Martinez took a breath, steadied his aim, and fired. The HVAP round left the barrel with a crack that was sharper, louder than conventional ammunition. It crossed the distance to the Panther in less than a second. The impact was visible even at that range, a bright flash on the tank's glassy plate followed immediately by a gout of flame from the engine deck. The Panther lurched to a stop, and within seconds, its crew was bailing out through every available hatch. Martinez had punched straight through the frontal armor, something that should have been impossible for a Sherman. The tungsten penetrator had continued through the interior of the tank, igniting ammunition and fuel, turning the vehicle into a pyre. The other 2 Panthers immediately began reversing, their commanders suddenly aware that they faced a threat they had not anticipated. Chen's platoon engaged them with HVAP as they withdrew, scoring one more penetrating hit before the German tanks escaped into the cover of the woods. 3 HVAP rounds fired, 2 Panthers destroyed or disabled, and 0 American losses. It was a result that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. When Chen reported the engagement to his battalion commander, he was ordered to submit a detailed after-action report under classified protocols. The nature of the ammunition he had used was not to be discussed over radio or mentioned in standard unit logs. Word spread anyway, as it always does in military units. Tankers talked to each other, and news of a weapon that could kill Panthers traveled faster than any official communication. Crews who had not received HVAP began asking their commanders when they would get access to it. Supply officers were besieged with requests for allocation. The response was always the same: the ammunition was in critically short supply, distribution was being handled at Army level, and units would receive their allocation when and if higher command deemed it appropriate. For many tankers, this was their first indication that something revolutionary was happening, even if they did not yet understand the full scope of what HVAP represented. As summer turned to autumn and the Allied armies pushed across France toward the German border, HVAP slowly became more available, though never in the quantities that field commanders requested. Production had ramped up, but tungsten remained a bottleneck. Every round manufactured meant tungsten that could not be used for cutting tools, for armor-piercing aircraft ammunition, for the dozens of other applications that demanded this precious material. The allocation process became a matter of constant negotiation and priority assessment. Armored divisions leading the advance received preference. Units expected to face the heaviest German resistance were supplied first. Tank destroyers mounting 76mm guns also began receiving compatible HVAP rounds, expanding the number of vehicles that could threaten German heavy armor. The Germans, for their part, remained largely unaware that anything had changed. Individual tank crews reported being penetrated by Sherman fire at ranges they considered safe, but these reports were often dismissed as flukes or attributed to side shots. The Wehrmacht was facing catastrophic losses across multiple fronts, and the destruction of individual tanks rarely warranted detailed investigation. Captured HVAP rounds were few, as American crews were under orders to account for every shell fired and to recover any duds if possible. When German intelligence finally obtained an intact HVAP round in late 1944, their analysis confirmed what Allied planners had hoped: there was no immediate countermeasure. The tungsten penetrator was simply too dense and too fast for existing armor schemes to stop reliably without adding weight that would make tanks unmaneuverable. The forests of the Hurricane stood like dark sentinels, their branches stripped bare by artillery and their trunks scarred by machine gun fire. It was November now, and the cold had settled into the bones of every soldier who fought there. For the men of the 4th Armored Division, the Hurricane represented everything terrible about the European theater compressed into a few square miles of hell. The trees were so dense that tanks could barely maneuver. German positions were dug in so deep that even direct hits from heavy shells often failed to dislodge them. And somewhere in that maze of timber and mud, Panther tanks waited in ambush positions carefully chosen over weeks of preparation. Sergeant First Class William Delaney had been fighting in Shermans since the landings in Normandy. He had survived the hedgerow country, the race across France, and the brutal house-to-house fighting in Aachen. His tank, which his crew had nicknamed Hellraiser, bore the scars of dozens of engagements. Patches of different colored paint marked where armor had been welded over holes. The barrel of the main gun had been replaced twice. Delaney himself had been wounded once, taking shrapnel in the shoulder when his tank was hit by an anti-tank gun near Mordyne. He had returned to duty after 2 weeks in a field hospital, refusing a chance to rotate back to England for recovery. His crew needed him, he said, and besides, he knew Hellraiser better than any replacement ever could. On a morning thick with fog, Delaney received a briefing that made his stomach tighten. His platoon was to advance along a logging road toward a crossroads that intelligence believed was lightly defended. The objective was to secure the intersection and hold it while infantry moved up to clear the surrounding woods. It was the kind of mission that looked simple on a map and turned deadly in execution. Delaney had learned to trust his instincts about these things, and his instincts were screaming that something was wrong. The Germans did not leave crossroads lightly defended, not in country like this where a single well-placed tank could control an entire road network. Before moving out, Delaney inspected the ammunition his crew had loaded. They carried the usual mix of high explosive for infantry and soft targets, white phosphorus for marking and screening, and armor-piercing for engaging German armor. But tucked into a special rack, marked with yellow bands and stenciled with warnings in red, were 6 HVAP rounds. Delaney had fired exactly 3 of these in combat, and each time the results had been extraordinary. One shot had destroyed a Panzer IV at over 1,000 yards. Another had crippled a Panther that had been terrorizing his company for 2 days. The third had been a miss, but only because his target had moved at the last second. He treated these rounds like sacred objects, checking and rechecking their condition, making sure his loader knew exactly where they were stored. The advance began slowly, the Sherman's tracks churning through mud that tried to pull them down with every meter. Visibility was perhaps 50 yards in the fog, and Delaney could hear but not see the other tanks in his platoon moving parallel to his position. The logging road was barely wide enough for a single vehicle, forcing them to advance in column rather than spread out in a proper formation. Delaney stood in the commander's hatch, his eyes straining to penetrate the mist, every nerve alert for the first sign of danger. His gunner, a young man from Ohio named Private Joseph Kowalski, sat ready at his position, one hand on the traverse control and the other on the firing mechanism. The fog played tricks with sound. Twice Delaney thought he heard the rumble of diesel engines, only to realize it was his own tank's exhaust echoing off the trees. Birds that should have fled the area days ago still called from the branches, their cries sharp and sudden. Once, a deer burst from the underbrush and bounded across the road directly in front of Hellraiser, causing Delaney's driver to brake so hard that everyone inside was thrown forward. They all laughed nervously at that, the kind of laughter that comes when fear needs somewhere to go. Then the fog lifted, and Delaney saw them. 3 Panthers positioned in a perfect ambush, hull down behind fallen timber with only their turrets visible. The range was perhaps 400 yards, close enough that Delaney could see the muzzle break on the lead tank's gun. For a frozen instant, nobody moved. The German commander had probably been waiting for the entire American column to enter the kill zone before opening fire. But the sudden clearing of the fog had revealed his position too early, and now both sides were caught in a moment of mutual recognition. Delaney's training took over. His voice was steady as he gave orders, identifying the target, ordering HVAP loaded, directing Kowalski to aim for the center mass of the lead Panther. There was no time for precise shot placement, no opportunity to wait for a flank shot. The Germans would fire in seconds, and at this range, a Panther's gun would tear through Hellraiser's armor like it was paper. Everything depended on speed and on the tungsten penetrator now sliding into the breech of Delaney's gun. Kowalski fired before the German gunner could. The HVAP round covered the distance so fast that Delaney barely had time to see it leave the barrel before impact. The Panther shuddered, and for a heartbeat, nothing seemed to happen. Then flames erupted from every opening in the turret, bright orange fire that turned the fog around it into a hellish glow. The crew never had a chance to bail out. The tungsten had penetrated directly into the ammunition storage, and the resulting explosion had been instantaneous. The other 2 Panthers were already traversing their turrets toward Hellraiser, and Delaney knew his crew would not have time to reload before one of them fired. He screamed for his driver to reverse, to get them back into the cover of the trees, but the Sherman's transmission was never quick to respond. Then salvation came from an unexpected direction. Another tank from Delaney's platoon, commanded by Lieutenant Sarah Brennan, had worked its way into a flanking position through the woods. Her Sherman appeared at the edge of the clearing, already lined up on the second Panther. Her crew fired HVAP from a range of less than 300 yards, striking the German tank in the side armor where it was most vulnerable. The penetrator went completely through the vehicle, exiting on the opposite side in a spray of metal fragments. The 3rd Panther commander, realizing he was caught between 2 American tanks and that his supposedly invincible armor was failing him, made the decision to retreat. His tank began backing rapidly, its engine roaring as the driver pushed it to maximum speed. Delaney's crew had reloaded by now, and Kowalski tracked the retreating Panther with his sight. The range was opening, 600 yards, 700, but HVAP was designed for exactly this kind of long-range engagement. Kowalski led the target slightly, accounting for its movement, and fired. The round struck the Panther's rear armor, which was thinner than the front but still substantial. The tungsten penetrator punched through and detonated the fuel tanks. The German tank rolled to a stop, burning from end to end. 3 Panthers destroyed in less than 2 minutes. For Delaney and his crew, it felt like a miracle. They had faced the tanks they feared most at point-blank range and had won decisively. But as the adrenaline began to fade, Delaney realized what the engagement truly represented. Without HVAP, his platoon would have been annihilated. There was no conventional ammunition that could have penetrated those Panthers from the front at that range. The Germans had positioned themselves perfectly for an ambush that should have been unstoppable. Only the possession of this secret ammunition had turned certain defeat into overwhelming victory. Lieutenant Brennan's voice crackled over the radio, shaky but professional, asking for status reports. Delaney responded that Hellraiser was intact and operational. The other tanks in the platoon checked in one by one. Miraculously, no American vehicles had been lost. The infantry moved up as planned, securing the crossroads while engineers worked to clear the burning German tanks from the road. Delaney climbed out of his hatch and walked to where the lead Panther sat smoldering. The hole where the HVAP round had penetrated was surprisingly small, barely larger than the tungsten penetrator itself. But the damage inside must have been catastrophic to produce such a violent explosion. A captain from the Divisional Intelligence Section arrived by jeep an hour later, asking questions about the engagement and specifically about the ammunition used. Delaney provided his account, careful to follow the security protocols he had been taught. The captain made notes, collected the paperwork documenting the expenditure of HVAP rounds, and reminded Delaney that discussion of these weapons outside official channels remained prohibited. Before leaving, the captain told Delaney that what he and his crew had accomplished was being studied at the highest levels. The ability of Sherman tanks equipped with HVAP to engage and destroy Panthers was changing tactical planning across the entire front. Similar stories were unfolding wherever HVAP reached the front lines. Near Metz, a company of Shermans equipped with the ammunition had ambushed a German armored column, destroying 5 Panthers and 3 Panzer IVs without loss. In the Vosges Mountains, tank destroyers using HVAP had turned back a German counterattack, knocking out heavy armor at ranges that German commanders had considered safe. Each engagement added to a growing body of evidence that the balance of armored warfare had shifted fundamentally. The Sherman, derided by some as a death trap and mocked by others as inadequate, had become genuinely dangerous when armed with the right ammunition. Yet the limitations remained painfully clear. Production of HVAP continued to lag behind demand. Some units received generous allocations while others received none at all, creating disparities that field commanders found frustrating. A tank crew might fight for weeks with only conventional ammunition, enduring losses that could have been prevented, only to receive HVAP rounds after the heaviest fighting in their sector had ended. The allocation system, while necessary given the scarcity of tungsten, meant that the advantage HVAP provided was never distributed evenly across the front. There were tactical limitations as well. HVAP was optimized for penetration, which meant it was less effective than standard ammunition against soft targets. The tungsten penetrator would punch clean through light armor or fortifications without fragmenting, limiting the damage it caused to unarmored personnel or structures. Crews had to make constant judgments about which ammunition to use for which target. Using HVAP against a German half-track or anti-tank gun position was wasteful. Using conventional ammunition against a Panther was suicidal. The mental calculus required to make these decisions in the chaos of combat added another layer of stress to jobs that were already among the most dangerous in the Army. The secrecy surrounding HVAP also created operational complications. Because the ammunition was classified, detailed information about its capabilities could not be shared freely with infantry or artillery units who needed to coordinate with armor. Forward observers calling for tank support might not know whether the responding Shermans carried HVAP or conventional ammunition, making it difficult to plan attacks that relied on engaging specific targets. Some higher-level commanders, unaware of VAP's existence, continued to employ Sherman units in ways that assumed the tanks could not threaten heavy German armor, missing opportunities to use them more aggressively. As December arrived and the weather turned truly brutal, the character of the fighting changed. The Allied advance had slowed as supply lines stretched thin and German resistance stiffened near the border of the Reich itself. Both sides were exhausted, and there was a sense among many soldiers that the war might pause for winter, resuming in spring when conditions improved. This hope was shattered on the morning of December 16 when German forces launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest. The attack came as a complete surprise, smashing through lightly defended sectors and driving deep into Allied territory. The German plan relied heavily on armored spearheads, Panthers and Tigers leading battle groups that would exploit gaps in the American lines. The Wehrmacht had husbanded its remaining tank reserves for this operation, and the quality of German armor involved in the offensive was higher than the Allies had faced in months. For American units caught in the path of the attack, the next weeks would be a desperate struggle for survival. And for Sherman crews armed with HVAP, it would be the ultimate test of whether their secret weapon could truly change the outcome of a battle that threatened to reverse all the gains of the past 6 months. Technical Sergeant Marcus Holland was asleep in a barn near the Belgian village of Rocherath when the artillery barrage began. The first shells landed at 0530, walking across the landscape in a pattern that spoke of careful preparation. Holland rolled out of his sleeping bag and ran for his tank, a Sherman he had named Iron Duke after the British general. His crew was already there, having been on alert rotation and heard the barrage start. They mounted up quickly, the driver firing the engine while Holland climbed into the commander's position. All around them, the village was coming alive with confused activity as American units tried to understand what was happening. The radio net was chaos, multiple voices talking over each other, reports of German infantry attacking in strength, calls for artillery support, requests for orders that no one seemed able to provide. Holland's company commander finally came on the frequency, his voice tense but controlled. German armor was reported moving toward their position in company strength. All available Shermans were to move to defensive positions along the main road and prepare to engage. Holland acknowledged the order and directed his driver toward a spot he had scouted days earlier, a small rise that offered good fields of fire while providing some hull-down protection. As Iron Duke settled into position, Holland could see other Shermans from his company deploying to the left and right, spreading out to cover the likely avenues of approach. The morning was dark and overcast, with snow beginning to fall in thick flakes that reduced visibility. Holland checked his ammunition load and was relieved to find 8 HVAP rounds among the usual assortment. His loader, a corporal named Daniel Wu, had already segregated them, placing them where he could reach them instantly if needed. They settled in to wait, the crew silent, each man occupied with his own thoughts about what was coming. The German tanks appeared out of the snow like ghosts, their shapes indistinct at first but growing clearer as they approached. Holland counted at least a dozen, a mix of Panthers and what looked like Panzer IVs, advancing in a loose formation that suggested experienced crews. They were perhaps 1,800 yards out, still beyond effective range for conventional ammunition but well within the envelope where HVAP could be deadly. Holland waited, letting them close, knowing that the longer he held fire, the better his chances of a first-round hit. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. At 1,200 yards, Holland gave the order to engage. Wu slammed an HVAP round into the breech, and Holland's gunner, Specialist Thomas Grant, centered his sight on the lead Panther. The shot felt good the instant Grant fired, the kind of shot where you know before impact that it is going to connect. The HVAP round flew true, striking the Panther high on its frontal plate. The German tank did not explode dramatically, but it stopped moving, smoke beginning to pour from its engine deck. The crew bailed out seconds later, running through the snow toward cover. All along the American line, other Shermans were firing now, the distinctive crack of HVAP rounds mixing with the deeper boom of high-explosive shells. The German formation wavered, several tanks stopping to return fire while others continued to advance. A Panzer IV took a direct hit and erupted in flames. A Panther fired back, and one of the American Shermans to Holland's left was struck in the turret, the crew scrambling out as fire spread through the interior. The engagement had become general, a confused melee where both sides were firing as fast as they could load. Holland's crew worked with the smooth efficiency of long practice. Wu fed HVAP rounds into the breech as fast as Grant could fire them. Each shot was aimed deliberately, each one calculated to maximize the chance of penetration. A Panther at 900 yards took a round through its mantlet and ground to a halt. Another at 700 yards was struck in the side as it turned to flank, the tungsten penetrator passing completely through and exiting in a shower of sparks. The German advance was breaking apart, individual tanks retreating or burning while others tried to press forward. The snow was falling harder now, making it difficult to see, turning the battlefield into a confused tableau of muzzle flashes and burning vehicles. Then Holland saw it, a shape larger than the others, moving with ponderous confidence through the wreckage of the German attack. A Tiger, its massive gun traversing slowly as it searched for targets. Holland felt his stomach clench. Even with HVAP, a Tiger was a formidable opponent, especially from the front. Its armor was thicker than a Panther's, and its gun could destroy a Sherman from any angle at any range. Holland made a decision. He ordered his driver to reposition, to get Iron Duke into a position where they could engage the Tiger from the side. It was risky, exposing them to fire from other German tanks, but a frontal engagement with a Tiger was almost certainly suicide. Iron Duke moved, tracks churning through snow and mud, hull swinging around a cluster of farm buildings that provided momentary cover. Holland could see the Tiger now, about 600 yards distant, its attention focused on another American tank that was dueling with a Panther. The Tiger's side armor, though still substantial, was vulnerable to HVAP at this range. Holland steadied his breathing and gave Grant the clearest firing solution he could. Wu loaded their second-to-last HVAP round. Grant fired. The tungsten penetrator struck the Tiger just below the turret ring, penetrating the whole side armor and continuing into the interior. For a moment, nothing happened, and Holland thought they had somehow failed to inflict serious damage. Then the Tiger lurched to a stop, and its turret stopped moving. Smoke began seeping from the hatches. The crew started bailing out, but slowly, suggesting they were dealing with casualties inside. Holland did not watch them. His attention was already shifting to the next threat, a Panther that had noticed Iron Duke's movement and was turning its gun toward them. They were out of HVAP. Wu was loading a conventional armor-piercing round, but Holland knew it would not be enough, not against a Panther at this angle. He ordered evasive action, and his driver threw the Sherman into reverse, trying to get back behind the farm buildings. The Panther fired. The shell missed by inches, passing so close to Holland's head that he felt the pressure wave. Iron Duke's engine roared as they gained the cover of the buildings, safe for the moment but effectively out of the fight until they could rearm. All across the sector, similar scenes were playing out. Sherman crews armed with HVAP were engaging German armor with unprecedented success, but the limitations of supply meant that once their special ammunition was expended, they reverted to the vulnerable position that had characterized American armor for so long. Some units had exhausted their HVAP allocation in the first hours of fighting. Others hoarded it carefully, waiting for the clearest possible shots. The overall result was a confused and desperate battle where tactical advantages shifted constantly depending on who had ammunition and who did not. By nightfall, the German offensive in Holland's sector had been blunted. Dozens of German tanks lay wrecked across the approaches to Rochrath, testimony to the ferocity of the defense. American losses had been significant as well, but the line had held. As darkness settled and both sides pulled back to regroup, Holland climbed out of Iron Duke and surveyed the battlefield. The snow had stopped, and in the moonlight, he could see the hulks of destroyed vehicles dotting the landscape like monuments to mechanized warfare. His crew had survived, and they had contributed to stopping an attack that could have broken through to vital supply depots. A supply truck arrived after midnight, bringing ammunition to replace what had been expended. Among the crates of high-explosive and conventional armor-piercing shells were 6 more HVAP rounds for Iron Duke. Holland signed for them personally, checking each one to ensure it was undamaged. As he loaded them into his tank, he thought about how strange it was that the outcome of enormous battles, involving thousands of men and hundreds of machines, could hinge on something as simple as access to the right kind of ammunition. The tungsten cores of these rounds, each one barely larger than a man's thumb, represented technological advantage measured in fractions of an inch of penetration. Yet those fractions meant the difference between victory and defeat, between survival and death. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.